Well, as those who are up grab a seat, I want to add my own encouragement for everyone to be making it out to what was mentioned on June 8th. If you are in the city of Los Angeles on June 8th, be here. We have really two significant elements to that celebration that we've been working on for a long time when we saw that, oh my, this church began in 1974. That makes this year the 50th year. And one of the things we want to do is to really honor the lives of Ken and Joni Gullickson, who planted and founded the church, but also all the lives that kind of joined and were so formative at that time. So I've been inviting a small group of them to come, and it's a growing group, and I've been amazed at how they're like, I'm going to be there. We're going to fly there. It means so much to them to be able to discover not only to be honored, but also to discover what has gone on with the Westside Vineyard and its future, and to be blessed by that. But also, we're going to culminate in the installation of Josh Shaw as the next lead pastor of this church. So it's significant and blesses you. And what's so unique about it is that we see this as an opportunity for the earliest lives, the formative lives, the beginning, to be blessed by seeing the future that lies in Josh and the future of the church to come, but also for Josh to be blessed by, and the future of this church, which is you, to be blessed by those that were there at the beginning. So a very unique time, and I want to encourage everyone to be able to make it. And because it is a time in which there is a significant transition in leadership, I've been privileged to be able to lead this community for over 33 years. That's a long time. That brings significant change in itself. And so with that, and I know that we've written letters to all who are on mailing lists, we've sent out emails, so I know for most people you get a lot of the backdrop, but for the few who aren't, I just want to be so clear that there has been much more to this process over the last few years behind the scenes than many may be aware of. It was like 5 years ago that really I initiated that I believe that we should make such a transition or a succession. And that is not because of any element of wanting for myself to leave in any way. It really grew out of the clarity that I believe deeply that we need a generational shift in leadership. And my experience over many years is that pastors wait too long to make that generational shift. So realizing that I'm in a position, I have the opportunity to be able to do that, to want to see that. And secondly, because I believe that the leadership of the future will be served by somebody else who brings their own gifts and their own distinct strengths that will serve best for the next stage, the next season, which is the one that we all will share in. And so I believe that God has truly prepared Josh and Brianne to be the ones to be able to lead that. And I've shared a list of their strengths and the ways that God's prepared them and the amazing things they bring to that I won't go into today. But I want you to grasp that this is something that God is very much doing. And we thought it would be good to be able to take just a short series over the next 3 weeks to talk about navigating new seasons. One, because we want to hear what God has to speak into our community and our life as we prepare and go through a season of transition, but also because we realize this, that everybody has got new seasons. Navigating new seasons of change is a significant part of every single life. When we're young, it might come as the changing of a school, where it's like, oh my gosh, everything around me, friends and all changes. It might be changing locations. It might be dramatic changes within family. It can come in slow ways that just kind of catch up with us, which can be just the changing of culture around us. A lot of people feel like, I don't even know the world I'm living in right now. It's so different than it was at an earlier stage. And I'm trying to figure out how to just be in a new season of the world I live in. Or maybe something like, I don't know, a global pandemic that brings a lot of change, and we all think, oh, well, we're out of that. But in truth, every one of us knows that life hasn't been quite the same. There's something about life that's just, how do I reorient myself? I feel a little disoriented. That's a part of a season of change. It can also be that which develops very slowly and naturally, like just the stages of life, where suddenly you go, I'm kind of at a different stage of life. I hear some of you laughing awkwardly almost, it's like, yes, you know that. And you just realize, at this stage, I just knew the world and how to live. I feel a little disoriented in this next stage of life. But it also can come through dramatic ways in which there's a change in our employment. And it's like, wow, I was always doing this, and it meant this, and now I'm not. And it changes relationships because of that. Or there's other changes of relationships, a death, a divorce, or it can be a change in health. All of these can bring times in which we go through a big change. And we're trying to kind of figure that out and how to really understand life going forward in a wise way. The truth and the kind of irony about change is that if we were just to talk about change, people are kind of like, yeah, I'm up for change. There's always something exciting, right? There's always things that you go like, yeah, some new possibilities. I see some new potential in life. I'm up for change. And then we start into change, and the problem is it involves change. I wanted this. I just wanted the potential to change. I didn't want to have to go through change. And so change is not as easy. In fact, it's been said, and we need to grasp this, that change is inevitable. But the second truth is, no one likes it. Those two truths, or as John Maxwell says, change is inevitable, growth is optional. How well we get through change is optional. How we navigate it, how we develop and grow rather than just get stuck is what can be something we need and want God to speak into. So that's why we are engaging this time together. And what we want is we're stepping back to ask God, how would you speak to us into this kinds of seasons of change? And what we find is that the whole story of God working with humanity has been one in which the people were constantly going through major seasons of change, and God was with them in it. And that is what I hope to have us grasp more than anything else, is that change is inevitable, but what will pull us through seasons of change is grasping afresh that God has a call on our lives. And that calling is what we need to grab and pull and hold on to. It's kind of like I was thinking this morning, like when you learn to ski and you start off with those little rope toes that are horrible. They're so dangerous, but you kind of hold on to the rope and it pulls you up that little bunny slope, and your skis are right in the ditch. So you don't really have to hold on much because the skis are just going through the ditch until they're not, until there's something that isn't quite as set. And then all of a sudden they peer off, and what do you need to do? Grab and hold on tight and get yourself back on. Sometimes when we feel like things are getting off, what we need to do is hold on tight. Now, what we find in terms of how God speaks to this and speaks to seasons of change is that the Bible doesn't provide a manual for it. There is no place where it says, okay, let's go through how we go through. What we find is that God is with the people, and we learn some things from seeing what they go through. And this is what the Bible does often, is it speaks of how God worked in history, and that we can look back at those lives and we can learn something from them. And particularly, as many of you are familiar with, there are those lives, some are referred to as the patriarchs of the faith, the fathers of the faith, the heroes of the faith. There are those lives who God raised up that are so much a part of the story that people would look back to them and look to them and say, wow, what have we learned? How God was faithful, how God led, how these people met God in that time. And of course, the one that stands out and above all is the one that's referred to as the father of the faith, which is the life of Abraham. Some of you are familiar with the life of Abraham. He's the one who God first calls out to and calls him to himself and begins to give him a calling out to create a people who God would uniquely use to bless and transform and redeem the whole world. And we find these words in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 12, where it says this: the Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. What a simple statement. I mean, just so brief. But you and I need to step back and realize there was nothing simple about this for Abraham. Like, at all. Like, just think of the statement. Leave what? Leave your family. Leave your household. Leave everything that's familiar. That's not simple. That is like, wow. Like, I need to leave that to what? To reach the place that I'm taking you. And by the way, and we begin to see this and need to see this, along the way, you won't really know yet where you're going to be. Like, that's built into this. Did you catch that? I will show you. Okay, how about we define everything up front? No, it's not all defined up front. You'll go through that, but ultimately it leads to what? A very clear place that I have for you. I have purposes. You need to trust them. And so we begin to see this sense of you have to leave, you have to be in a time where you won't really completely know, and you'll be on the go, and then you will arrive at a place that I have for you. And he begins to speak into this. And we find this in the book of Hebrews, where in the New Testament it looks back and it speaks and lifts up Abraham, and it says this, Hebrews 11:8-10. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, has to go, he obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. In other words, he had to have this kind of disorienting dynamic as he's in that process. He lived in what? Tents. They had this sense of things weren't settled yet, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. It's a shared promise that they are all living into and moving towards. For he was doing what? Looking forward to the city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. What they're saying and grasping is that what set him apart, how Abraham becomes that father of faith for all of us, is that he was facing forward. He was looking towards what God had. That's what helped him to be able to make his way through this tremendous season of change. And ultimately, as it says, he was looking for what God was ultimately doing. It was a mystery in part to him, and it would not be ultimately fulfilled until God led all the people into the land, and yet still there was a great need, even when they were in the promised land. And they could not fully meet all that God had, because God had a Messiah who would come and become the ultimate one leading that change, and the ultimate leading into the truest of promised lands, which is God's eternal kingdom finally redeeming the whole world. That is the ultimate promised land. But in this journey with Abraham, he is stepping out with the faith he has, and he is looking forward. And what we see here is this process. We see that there is a process that he's about to go through, this process of leaving, this process of the unknown, and this process of landing. And so the first and larger thing that I want us to grasp about going through seasons of change, whether they be us as a community going through a change in leadership or any season of life, is that it's a process. And the first point is this, that we need to embrace seasons of change as a process of transition that involves an ending an in-between time, and then the beginning of a new season. And I want to say that I'm indebted to and want to share, as I have with the core, some of what is brought forward by William Bridges in his book, Managing Transitions, where he reflects upon such stages. And he says this: change is an event, but transition is the process you go through in response to the change. In other words, there is this sense of, okay, there's a change. You can put it in a sentence, you can define it, and saying we're changing from this way of doing our work to this way of doing our work. Corporations do it all the time. Or it could be a change from this leader to this leader. You can speak of the change in a single sentence, a single announcement. In fact, there really is that announcement kind of there when it speaks of Abraham, but it speaks of something larger. The real thing that we go through is more of a process, a transition. And it helps us to realize that it means I'm going to go through these three different types of the process: the ending, the new, the unknown, and the new. And so I just want to pop up, I think we have a graphic that might be able to be up there. Let's see there, where you can kind of see those stages, and I'll just kind of define them, unpack them for a quick moment. The first is the ending, which involves the ending, losing and letting go. He says transition starts with an ending. Every new beginning begins with what? Ending. You go through the ending of what was. While change may bring what is ultimately needed and better, they inevitably involve various losses to what was. These may include losses of familiar relationships, roles, spaces, and traditions. Things change, and we have attachments to them. We're going to talk a little bit about them, because part of that is being able to go through a process in which we let those things go. And some of that is grieving, some of that is just comfort, shifts in comfort and adjustments to those things. Then secondly, there's the neutral zone. People go through an in-between time when the old is gone, but the new isn't fully operational. It isn't all set and clear. This is the time between the old reality and sense of identity and the new one. People are creating new processes and learning what their new roles will be. Anytime you go through change, you kind of are leaving what's familiar, but you haven't necessarily grasped everything about what the next stage is going to be. And there is that strange time. Somebody described it well when they said it's kind of like Linus and Charlie Brown, right? You remember him at all? When his blanket is in the dryer. You know, he always was holding onto that security blanket, and that's fine. But once in a while, it needs to go through a cleaning. So he could be excited that it's in the washer, but he can't hold on to it for a little while. And it can be that time in which we feel it, or like the trapeze artists, when they've had to let go of one ring to hold on to the next, and they're kind of in midair. We kind of feel this sense of, I haven't landed yet, not fully landed. I'm discovering how this is going to land. So that's the in-between time, but it leads to a new beginning. He says beginnings involve new understandings, values, and attitudes that are brought to bear. Beginnings are marked by a release of energy in a new direction. They are an expression of a fresh identity. Well-managed transitions allow people to establish new roles with an understanding of their purpose, the part they play, and how to contribute and participate most effectively. As a result, they feel reoriented and renewed. That is what I see lies right out in front as Josh brings his leadership to bear on the community, is that kind of a new beginning, if you will. And what we need to realize about these kinds of stages is that they're not entirely linear. While there is some general sense in which we go through them in a certain manner from beginning to end, but in some ways they can often overlap. So it's very common for us to have a mixture of feelings when we're going through such a change, such a season of change. We can say, oh gosh, I kind of miss this, but at the same time, I'm kind of uncertain about this, and at the same time, I'm really excited about this. All of those could be said at the same time, because they're all kind of part of the process we go through in change. And some of you might find that to be true as you go through other seasons of change. There's things you miss. There's things that feel uncertain, unclear at this time, not quite grasping. But also there's things you're excited about in the new stage that you see ahead. Possibilities, things that you couldn't have enjoyed before, new potential. All of those things can be in it. And as we see these elements, so to speak, one of the things we realize is that this is something we see throughout the processes that God's people go through as God's leading them through change. And one of the places that we see this same kind of stage process is in the great Exodus. So some of you may be familiar, if you are, with the Old Testament, with the history of God's people, that a couple generations as we go from Abraham, you eventually have Joseph. Joseph is one who is a son among many brothers, and the brothers rise up and they strike Joseph down. They basically want to kill him, but they decide to just sell him off to some traveling slaveholders who are headed off, and he ends up in Egypt. Not a good situation. But he rises up eventually in Egypt and becomes kind of the chief administrator, and it comes at a time in which a great famine comes to the whole region. And so eventually his own family, those brothers, are sent down, and they come and they're trying to seek Egypt's help, as everybody was. And what do they find? Their brother in charge, the one that they tried to kill. The brother Joseph welcomes them, and those people, the people of God, are able to come and survive the famine in Egypt. That's all good and fair, except when Joseph dies, he had had favor with the Pharaoh of Egypt. There is no more of that favor, and the Pharaoh, the next, begins to exploit them, oppress them, and eventually enslave them. And so what had been one season that had served God's people and his purposes, now it's not. So God raises up one that is going to redeem them, that is going to deliver them out of Egypt, and that is Moses. And so God calls out Moses, and you may recall something of that. We read in Hebrews 11 where it says, by faith, here we go again, by faith, this is what leads us. This is what we're seeking to do well, is to live by faith. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. And here we see again that Moses grew up, as some of you remember, in Pharaoh's household, and he had gained an understanding of high education, how to administrate things, how the whole royal family worked, what the dynamics were, how to be diplomatic, how to be a leader. All of these things, that doesn't end up faring well. He ends up out for another 40 years into the desert, which is a whole element in itself. But finally, God calls him to come and to lead the people out of Egypt, which is out of what? Out of everything he was familiar with. Leave the wilderness where you've gotten comfortable with the people there, and you're going to leave Egypt, which is what you grew up in. You're going to leave everything familiar. And you're going to go through what? A wilderness, a time in which, it won't all be clear. But where is it all heading? To the promised land, to that which I will bring your people into. So once again, we see this whole process. And it leads to this. As we watch that people go through that, we need to learn this, and this is the second point I want to make. The first step in moving forward involves letting go of some attachments and connecting afresh to God's unchanging calling. One of the things we can presume, that this was not easy for Abraham, it wasn't easy for Moses. We should be struck by the fact that they left everything that was familiar to them. And we can all have times where we feel like, what I really don't like is leaving these things that were like formative memories, the place that I grew up in, or the community the way it was, and the way that its certain patterns were. Just like you might be attached to some of those if you've been around for a long time, or certain connections. We can feel, it's really hard to let go of some of those attachments. And let me say to you, leading for 33 years here, that has involved thousands of lives for me. And I have gone through many transitions of those kinds of attachments. And it's never been easy. I had a note recently from a gal just a couple months ago who was here 30 years and 3 venues ago when I was involved in what was going on in her life. And it was a really profound time for her. So we're engaging 30 years prior. There are so many attachments that I've had like that I've had to kind of process and go through, and they've never been easy. As I'm looking at these past, 50 years, particularly the past 33, they're filled with lives and things that were connected, things that we did, the way we did them, and all of those were hard. They were hard for my wife and I. But we had to constantly learn how to let go of being attached to something we enjoyed for the sake of what was coming. We had to do it in small ways, but sometimes it's in big ways that we do that. And I know that we have a propensity when life changes and we go like, I don't like this. The things that I'm comfortable with are they're being messed up. We're changing churches, we're changing this, we're changing that. One of the propensities we have to do is just blame. We just get upset. Like we want to blame because we think somebody took those things away. Like if I don't like the way life is, somebody took those things away. If you're older, it's got to be the young people. Those young people, they're just messing with the world and taking it away. We do. We love to blame as opposed to just say, God, what do you have? It's just way easier to blame somehow, but it's vain. It gets nowhere. Or another thing we do is we tend to idealize the past. Whenever we go through changes, suddenly the very things that we once wanted to have change and now we're in change, we suddenly look back and go, you know what? It was so good back then. Do you remember that? We do. We start to idealize the way it was, and everybody looks back and thinks, oh, if it was just like that. And this is exactly what we find the people of God did. They get out of enslavement, and as they're going through the wilderness, some of you recall and are quite familiar, they do what? They begin complaining and saying, it was so good back there in Egypt. Are you kidding? And the people, the truth is, there was some elements. If you go back, what they complain about, and I won't have us look at the passage, but is that they had more regular food than they did in the desert. And the truth is, if we start saying, well, where am I most comfortable? Well, we might have had certain comforts back then. And if we kind of decide, well, God's with me because of comforts, then we're going to judge that maybe there were things that were more pattern and routine in the past, and we liked it now. But now we're in a desert. It's not always as simple as it used to be, not as simple as we used to be. So now suddenly we idealize the past, not realizing that there are great things God is doing and wants to do right now, that he wanted to change. But it's really easy to start idealizing and looking back. And the part that we need to realize sometimes as we go through seasons of change is that there's an inevitable nature to them. Life is going to change. Life is going to change. We don't like it. I understand that. But it's going to change. And sometimes what we need to do is stop thinking that something's wrong. Because a lot of times we just assume that something is wrong, it shouldn't have changed. Or we look back and say, God can't be in this. And a lot of that is just the way that we don't understand that there's a natural part of life that needs to and will change. I remember somebody coming to me once and saying, I'm thinking of marrying this person, but honestly, I don't quite feel with them the way that I did about my first love in childhood. And so I'm wondering, do you think that's a problem? And I remember reflecting on that a little bit and realizing, you know what? No one's going to feel the same way as they did about their first love in childhood, in their youth. Why? Because they were in their youth. See, what you felt in youth is just part of what you feel, and you just don't have the same feelings. There's a certain rush and all these unique things that are going on in youth. You can't suddenly have your youthful soul again in the same way. It was a very exploratory, exciting type of time. You mature in time. What my wife and I had early in our marriage is different from what we have now, and I love what we have now, and I love what we had then. All of it is a part of us. Let me just say this again. All of it is a part of you. This is why we have this inclination towards nostalgia. We liked the past because it is a part of us. But the problem is you need to remember the past, not stay in it. You can't. And they're different things. We get stuck. We kind of settle down in the past, not realizing we can't go back. Many people feel this with God. I wish I could feel what I felt when I first discovered God's love and what it meant for me, and that he gave me an identity and called me out and all that. It's incredibly exciting. You cannot go back, though, and have the exact same feeling, because that was a stage in life. You have to realize that is a gift, and I remember it, but I got to move forward. This is one of the things we see more than once with the people of God. What they would do is they would have a time where God really met them, and they wanted to be able to remember it, which means to always remember that it spoke to how they should then live in the future. Not to stay there, but to remember it. So they would stack stones as like a little memorial. And then when they were done stacking the stones and said, we're always going to remember this, what did they do? They didn't camp there with the stones. They got up and they moved forward. And we need to learn to do that in our lives, where we say, this was a gift, and I'm always going to hold on to it as I then get ready to move forward with that reality, which is meaning what it means to internalize the quality going forward. I'm never going to forget that God did this and he can do these types of things again. But the future he has for me isn't there, it's there. And we have to be able to be willing to say, and what does God want to be doing now? We need to face forward. We need to be in times where we then hold on to the reality that God has a purpose, and the purpose is what is pulling us forward. And then remember, what is it that God wants to do? And that is so important for a church who gets attached to its patterns and its style and its whatever it may be. And those things may be cherished. There may be very wonderful things that we have done, or the connection that you and I may have. But the ultimate question is, how do I take hold of what God's ultimate purpose is? See, the purpose of the church does not change. It is to be people who embody the Father's heart. That we are people who embody the Father's heart as we embody Jesus. We are people who care for a lost world and welcome God's continual process of finding his lost children. Becoming the kind of people who where for one, we would leave the 99 to find them. That's the kind of heart that God has. That we embody that and become those kinds of people who both love God, but also love the fact that he wants to continually seek those lost children. That doesn't change. The question is letting that work its way back into our hearts afresh, holding on even tighter to the fact that God called you. He called you to that, and he still calls you to that. And the future needs to be about it. Whatever age or stage you might be at, that's what he's doing. Thirdly, when we leave some of what may be familiar, we need to embrace the opportunity to exercise faith and experience dependence on God. I include this because one of the things that we see throughout these stages is when people are in that process of change, they're in a sense more dependent on God. Because once you have the familiar, you kind of get used to it. You kind of enjoy that familiarity. You feel a little bit, you might say, in control of things. But when you go out of that, when you're in a stage in which things aren't so settled, the familiar is changing, we feel a little less in control, which puts us in a position to be what? More dependent on God. So yes, they had their 3 meals when they were oppressed and enslaved, but now they're like, okay, we're in the desert. What are you going to do, God? And God says, I'll provide manna. But it's only going to be daily. You're going to have to depend on my provision. Oh, my. Really? Like we have to depend? Yes. And the same would be with water. And we could go through all the ways God provided for them. But the dynamic was, God was after this. I want a people who become more dependent on me, who have greater sense of faith, So living with some uncertainty, we don't like it, it's not comfortable, but guess what? It can be an opportunity for saying, okay, God, I need you to be providing along the way. Things aren't as settled as they used to be, and maybe it's in my health, my finances. Like when we're unsettled, we need to see that, okay, this is an opportunity for my faith to grow, for me to get back into a profound dependence on God. And that's a part of it. And finally, number 4, we need to embrace how different leaders serve different stages in the journey. And realize as we look back upon the times in that God was working with his people, that every season can serve its own time. And different leaders can serve different stages. This was what becomes so clear as we see this process lead out of Moses leading the people through the wilderness, and he is the leader that God had so clearly raised up to be able to do that. For he had been raised, in Pharaoh's house, so he had gained the ability to understand the family and the diplomacy of dealing with such authority and power. So when he's called to be the one who challenges Pharaoh to let the people go, he was in a position and well prepared for that. He'd also spent 40 years out in the wilderness where he learned a lot about navigating the wilderness. So he's so well prepared for that. But as the people get through the land, guess what? They come to a new stage. They come right to the edge of the promised land at the end of their long journey. And it's time, and there's a need for a new leader. That would be Joshua. That would be Joshua, who God raises up. Now, Joshua was a very different leader. Joshua was a military leader. As the people come to the place where they must take the land, they didn't need the diplomacy. They needed a military leader. They needed someone who has eyes to see how to engage taking this land. And you may recall that at that point, they send out 12 spies to spy the land of the Canaanites and say, what do you see? And they come back with a report. And 10 of them come back and say, no way, we saw giants. They are literally giants. Literally, like people use the word today. Literally giants, And there's no way we can take it. But 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, they say, no. If God is with us, we can take this. They had eyes to see what God could do. They had eyes to see what God could do. They had the right preparation, Joshua, to be able to be the one who would lead the people forward into that next season. And without trying to overlay this, I really do believe that Joshua is one who God has prepared to lead into that next season. Has those eyes to see, has the skills and the things to be able to guide well into that next season. In different ways, there are different seasons and different leaders leading into those seasons. What I want us to grasp, though, as we close is this. The question that we go through when we go through seasons of change, the ultimate challenge, the underlying challenge is this. Are we still able to move? Are we still able to be those who can look forward? Did you notice in every single account, the focus was on what? Look forward. Look at what I'm doing. The challenge for a lot of us is whether we're really facing forward, or we're kind of face down, or we're kind of looking back. I think the word for the Lord to us is to face forward, to realize that whatever God's doing, it's not behind you. Whatever he's doing is in front of you, and it always is. And so I want to bring these final words that we see that God brings to the people. He challenges them with. In Deuteronomy 1, 6-8, we come to this point in which the people have come to a certain area where they've begun to, they camp there, where they could kind of see the promised land ahead of them. And God says this to them at one point. The Lord our God said to us, you have stayed at this mountain too long. It is time to break camp and move on. Look, I am giving all this land to you. Go in and occupy it. You've stayed at this mountain too long. It's time to break camp. Those are words that I think can speak to a lot of us throughout our lives. They can speak to us about our community even here of like, well, we're settled in the familiar. there's a time we need to break camp, but it can also speak to us about all sorts of ways in which we just settle into this certain stage. And we need to realize that maybe those tent pegs, they're kind of getting a little settled into the ground, a little too settled into the ground. They've been there a little too long. They weren't meant to be. But you know, familiarity is familiarity. We begin to kind of give ourselves and get more passive in the position where I just want things to be settled. We all do. So we start settling. But there's a point at which God is always saying to us, you're not where you are yet. You're not where I want you to be yet. There is more that I have for you communally to accomplish. It is time to break ground. God may be saying to you, it's time to break ground. It's time to be ready to get up and to move. In due time, we all need to be in that place in which we're able and our hearts are open to God to say, okay, I'm available. Okay, I'm looking forward. Okay, I'm ready to move into the new things that you have. Let's pray. God, as we think about our lives, and you know that we're creatures who you've gifted us with familiarity. You've gifted us with many things that root our lives. Families, households, so many things that stay the same every day. But you never want us to be settled in this world. You never want us, as you've said, to be believing that this is our ultimate home as it is. So we pray that you help us to recognize that life as it is not the end space. We open our hearts to just let you call us forward. We open our hearts that in due time you would help us to break camp, loosen the tent pegs, roll up some things, and get ready to move. Would you open us up to be those who are ready to move as you lead us? May you help us to have eyes to see that there are things ahead for us, things for us to do within our lifetime. May you help us be those who could come to that place like Abraham and Moses and David, like those who lived out their lives, and it was said of them that they served your purposes and finished what you had for them to do. May we be those who are willing to finish what you have for us to do, that brings your kingdom, the fullness of your kingdom, Jesus, into this world. And then we can know that we will have served those purposes well. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's stand and let's respond in worship together.
Like every week, I just want to encourage you.